Okay, so now we're going to talk about 1,000 years of medieval Europe. And we already covered how um, Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople. That is the Byzantine Empire. And so what's going to happen is that the West is going to fall to the barbarians. And of course, when an area or region falls, you have several hundred years pass and then you start to rebuild. And this is what we're looking at in medieval Europe. Um, it's the age of faith, 1,000 years. And really what happens is this area, this region of the world, is rebuilt with religion, Christianity, and the sword. So what I did was because it's just pretty much text, what I did was I included a bunch of images from the medieval period that you can see weapons or what a castle looked like or different artifacts you would find, well, that existed. But I also want to start with Duke University Chapel in Durham, North Carolina, because this is Gothic architecture, and that's what we're going to end with, the architecture. And we'll look at Romanesque and Gothic. And so this is really, we're just sort of skimming through 1,000 years so you could look at, the social structure, the politics, the governing, your place. Are you, are you a peon? Are you a nobleman? Are you a king? So we're just going to look at the whole spectrum and how religion plays a part in this. And so I just want to start with this to show you that we wouldn't have this. This is the interior. On the campus unless we had this period. And just as you looked at that last period when we looked at the Greeks, and I showed you how that influenced neoclassical period in Europe, in this country, in the 1700s. So this is why this is all relevant. So, these are just artifacts. I'm not going to I just put them there because it's more interesting, but they existed. And so this is the timeline. And that here you have that migratory period, 500 to 800, that early part of rebuilding. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have generals that create these empires that get control of this region. And the first one is the Carolingian Empire, who was Charlemagne. We're in this course not going to go into all those details. That would be a history course. But you just see an overview of the period and some significant things that happened, which is what we've been talking about the whole time. The Romanesque period, we're going to look at the architecture and the Gothic. This is high culture. Greek, classical, high culture. Mesopotamia, Babylonians, high culture. So this is the Ottoman Empire. This is the second wave. And this is when the first crusades start to happen. The play of Daniel and these other literary or theatrical titles, that is in another unit that I separated from this, depending how much time we have. And so we probably will talk about St. Thomas Aquinas, which, this is a period when the humanities, because you're moving towards the Renaissance. The Renaissance is the rebirth of humanities. And that means the rebirth of Greek classicism. So how do you, and so this scientific period that's beginning, and so how do you prove, well, that God exists? Or so this is St. Thomas Aquinas. He says really it's faith first. So when we think about the Middle Ages or medieval Europe, it was very dark and dismal, and you're trying to turn straw into gold. People lived a horrible, suffering life if you were a peasant, and it's just a lot of turmoil. Even if you were wealthy and you lived in a castle, it was nasty. You put these tapestries on the wall, but people are eating with their hands, and you've got these movies that it looks very romantic, Romeo and Juliet, those kind of things, but it's nasty. There are no indoor bathrooms. Dogs are running around, pooping on the floor. If it's in a castle, you've got these tapestries. There's no indoor plumbing. There's no heating and air. It's cold. That's what the tapestries are for. People don't bathe, okay? So yeah, it is romanticized depending on who you are and what your lot in life was. But actually, it's pretty nasty period in terms of social hygiene and the like. And it was very violent depending on which, what your lot was in life, as I said. But even with that, you know, it's it's a period when a couple of important things, very important things happened, because really it was the rise eventually of urban civilization, urban towns, um, and guilds, and that's more towards the Romanesque and the Gothic part, where you have cities and guilds and silversmiths, and you have trade and businesses, and it also is the rebirth of humanism eventually. So that's actually sort of important, although it's 1,000 years of some pretty dramatic and a lot of suffering. Um, so for all this time, they are culturally stagnant because it's so faith-based. And you'll see where the church gets corrupt. This is the Catholic Church. And they're not interested in science. It's all like, hold down the fort, which is work the land for the king and go to church, even though you can't read and everyone is ignorant, except for a very small number of people in the population. And you got the Black Plague, and it's just ongoing. Um, so this is what you would maybe be living in, this little hut here, this thatched or mud place, mud roof, whatever. But um, you know, everyone is it's landowners. When you rebuild, it's landowners, these kingships, and then you have these people, these peasants that work on your land, and when they're working on that land, they owe you um, duty. They give you, the peasants grow your food, they serve in your army. The landowner would probably maybe sleep with the wife, or excuse me, the bride, if you were going to get married. I mean, it was pretty brutal. So we're really looking at a feudal system. And as you can see right here, I have an asterisk, and the blue means, this is sort of important, that by the time you have the Carolingian monarchs, they appoint their own clergy. They appoint their own clergy. Now, that's a problem, because that's how you control people. Is the clergyman is going to do what you would like because you selected him. And again, during this period, this of the medieval, the Byzantine is flourishing, and that's still the Roman Empire that's flourishing, and civilization remains, as we talked about in the last unit. So, so then it falls back. It gets better, but then it falls back, and this is what I'm saying. The landowners possess the army. You're working on it. You're a vassal. You have no power. But the landowner is dependent upon you, although you have no power, and the food you raise. And so I put some castles in this PowerPoint. Um, and so it is feudal system, which is the noble class is supported by the peasants. All right, that's what we're talking about. And the noble class is picking the clergy. So. But you do eventually have the rise of towns in the middle period, the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are called the medieval period. It's called the Dark Ages. It has a lot of different names. And it is until the late Middle period, 11th. We're talking about 11th century. Again, this is between 500 to 1400. or late 1300s. I just rounded it off because 1400s is pretty much the Renaissance. And so that's what we're talking about, this the feudal system that eventually moves into guilds and more organized system of governing and economics. So, by these are little gargoyles you're going to see on different cathedrals. And so by the end of the 1300s, you're going to see that the church is completely integrated into the feudal system. And they do create some reform. You're going to see how that happens. Now, they're still chosen by an emperor until they can get out from under that. And that's going to be with the Emperor Henry, who's a child. And we'll look at that in a minute. So, see, this is also how this is, how there's a problem that the church can mitigate the church cannot save your soul, but can mitigate purgatory. So, that causes some abuse. Like, okay, give the church money so you can, don't spend so much time in purgatory. That's where you're judged at this time in Catholicism. And, this is also the time when you start having these crusades, which are pretty brutal. Going into all these regions and, just, murdering people for the sake of Christianity. And so you also have this abuse by the church of money and power and the Catholic Church. And so that's why you have later Martin Luther, who develops the idea of Protestantism, which is, hey, we don't need someone to intervene on our soul. And that is Protestant. So that came about just because of the abuse and that occurred eventually with the Catholic Church. So this is how and so here I have some nice little, again, this is like if you're someone's building a garment, if you're wealthy, noble class, then you're going to have some, probably some fine goods to wear. So what the church does is it has to get out from under. It has to get out from under these noblemen and these kings, because how do you do that? So they can have their own power. And so it actually happens around 1000 BC AD, when Henry IV is a child and he's an emperor. And, they just sort of say, look, we think that we really should be independent because he can't really, control the church in ways that we need to establish our order. So they actually gain back their control. Yep. So what happens is the national state replaces the clergy and monarchs eventually. And they work towards, in this latter period, the Gothic period, towards a more sort of less feudal and a more system that we're accustomed to today. Exchange of money, people have trades. You're not just working for a feudal lord, you actually have a business like your silversmith or whatever. But this is much later, and we're moving towards the Renaissance period. So this is just to show you just some of the differences. They were unreasonable. It's called the Age of Faith because they really didn't begin this idea of the rationale until really like Renaissance. Not actually until the 1500s. And so the church and the faith-based life stifles science. It stifles people's lot in life. And so look, outside, there's only a small percentage that could even read, very small percentage. And faith is superior over reason. That's strange to us now, but, we are our history. We live in our history. Just be glad you didn't live then. And so by the time you get to the 1200s, you do see some reasoning. And again, when you move towards the Renaissance, you're coming out of all these hundreds of years of Dark Ages. What do you look to? Well, who is going to be your inspiration? Well, it's the Greeks. So that's why you had to learn the Greeks and their philosophy, which you did really well on that paper, most of you, which is good because they go back to Aristotle and the rationale. And, you know, that's what brings us back to the humanities in the Renaissance, is revisiting the classical Greek. Keep in mind, the Roman Empire, a lot of that Greek ideas were remained feasible because the Romans kept that going. The Roman Empire in the Byzantine was up until like 1400, so that was still existing, or we would have lost that. But they're discovering all of these Greek ruins. They have to, like I said, for 1,000 years in sculpture, there's no sculpture of people, only certainly never an undraped one. It's all things to go, it's all churches, eventually cathedrals, and things to go into churches. That's what the focus is. Of course, that becomes very sophisticated as you move through this period. And we're actually coming to an end because this is when we get to a cathedral, this is that last part when things are coming together. And this is I call it a cathedral. It's a church, Romanesque church, but you have to compare it to the Gothic. And so you already saw what an early Christian church looked like. You already saw what the Islamic temple looked like, that octagonal plan. The Basilica of the the Greek, that's what early Christian Old St. Peter's is built on. And then you have this, which is built on the same idea of simple exterior and elaborate interior. Now, students, you need to learn this language because, you know, especially in the Greek. So when you look at this Romanesque, remember we said they did the arch principle. Very important. So this is all these arched windows are Roman-like. This is a pretty simple kind of exterior. Geometric groupings. These are cylinders. This is like rectangular. Limited windows, plain exterior. That's what we say. When we go to the Gothic, this is the high culture period. You can see this is very elaborate, and this is Chartres. And so this is pointed arches, pointed. This is a little, they become more pointed. This is a round, lot of stained glass. Tracery right here is the decorative carving of stone on the outside. I'll show you more of that. A lot of stained glass windows, a lot of light coming in. Everything, of course, the subject is religious. You have what you would call steeples if you are Christian, and these are actually spires. And these cathedrals, they build them higher and higher because it's this idea of, reaching heaven. And they were competing with each other. One region would, by the way, each region, we call them countries, like, the Italians were very detailed, where these are the French, more detailed, the English, not so much, pretty plain. So it depends on the region, what kind of, cathedral they built. And so you also have flying buttresses, which is I'm going to show you what that is. These are reinforcing, they look like spider legs and they come away from the building. They can be inside, but flying away from, you have that for structure. So this is the Gothic, those are those architectural elements that, and in our town, you can see down at the Methodist Church downtown, that is sort of a mix. It's predominantly Romanesque, but they have some Gothic characteristics. There's a little Gothic church on Green Street that you'll see a lot of these pointed arches. So This is a buttress. Flying. This is not a flying because it's actually built on the side, where a flying buttress is really away from the building. But this is a buttress. And so I closed this. I closed the medieval period. And like I said, I took off the literature and the theater because I'm not sure if we're going to get to that, but I've included it. And so this is the Milan Cathedral. Look at the tracery. This is amazing that exists today. This is in Milan. Stunning compared to the Romanesque, which is pretty, pretty simple and plain compared to what the cathedral became. And so I finished with going back to Duke University Chapel. This is Gothic architecture where you have, these spires, a pointed arch, not so many windows as others, but I also want to show you this, because if you look back to the early Christian floor plan of Old St. Peter's, here you have the nave. Here you have a transept that crosses it. There's not a courtyard like in the front, like you would see in Old St. Peter's, but the nave is that central body that I want you to know, and that here is the interior, and that is, students, that's the apse. This is the nave in the center area, the aisles on the other side. We're not going to talk about these. These are actually glowing vaults that I showed you with the, in the Roman period, that this is where you have two intersecting barrel vaults, so you can build these high cathedrals. And this is the apse, which is where the pulpit is. And that's why you needed to learn Old St. Peter's, because we're still, that was like 300, Old St. Peter's. This is, I'm going to say 1300, late 1200s. Okay, so that's that.